Good morning. It is Tuesday, July 29th, 2025, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 8:30 Pacific. Broadcasting live from Toronto, this is the Mothcast. Coming up in this next hour or so, we're going to be talking a bit about the situation, the deteriorating situation in Gaza, the rampant hunger that is now killing people, faster than bombs or bullets, although that is also still certainly part of the equation. And we'll also talk a bit about the climate ruling that came down from the UN late last week. So welcome, thanks so much for tuning in to the Mothcast here. I hope you all had a good weekend. If I'm looking a little extra crispy, it's because I was at the beach this weekend, got a little bit of a sunburn, and there is an extra audio device here that... Let me just make sure that... Yes. What is this? Cancel. Okay. I don't know what that... Okay, anyway, yeah, so... was at the beach this weekend, got a little cooked, I think, a little bit, but other than that, yeah. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. The other thing that I wanted to address too was, like I mentioned on Thursday last week, was that we were expecting a decision in the Hockey Canada trial to come down, and had hoped for a better outcome than we got. Like I had outlined at the top, that the trial judge had kind of made a point to sort of focus on kind of what is and is not consent, and so it seemed like maybe it might have a just outcome for the accusers. It turns out no, that all of those Hockey Canada players were found not guilty, and I think that is absolutely disgraceful, because the details of the case were the accuser or the victim survivor had gone with one of the players back to his hotel room. I believe she was already inebriated at the time. The two of them had sex, and then that guy's other friends, the other four accused, at least the other four accused, came in, and it turned into a group sexual assault on this victim. And so for that, with the trial judge making such an emphasis on consent, what is consent, what isn't consent, we all know that, of course, someone who is quite inebriated or under the influence can't really offer enthusiastic, informed, continued consent. They can't consent. And so to somehow come to the conclusion that the first sexual encounter where it was the two of them is one thing, but then also then conclude that the group sexual assault on her that immediately followed is somehow consensual or doesn't meet the level of assault in some way, I think is silly, and I think is quite clearly like a total, I don't know, lapse in judgment, incompetence on the judge's part. I don't know. And this is why victims don't come forward with accusations of sexual assault, especially if it's someone with whom there's like a power imbalance. There's been lots of reporting, sort of in the wake of this story initially breaking. I think it was last year, I think, about just how lauded these Hockey Canada guys are. You know, they're seen as, hometown heroes or, Canadian heroes. Often they're just treated like kings their whole way up. They're like rock stars the whole way up the ladder to the Hockey Canada level, to their level of competition. And so they often, they hold a lot of power, a lot of sway. And usually that ends up counting for a lot in cases like this where the party with power, usually it's the male party with power, whether it's any kind of fame or notoriety, it ends up sort of working in the defendant's favor, so there usually isn't anything to gain. For one thing, there's nothing to gain from what often folks will sort of rush to say is that it's like some kind of false accusation or something, or blown out of proportion. They're seeking money or notoriety in some way by accusing someone of sexual assault. There's nothing to gain from that. That argument makes no sense at all. And also just in terms of why just victims or survivors don't come forward is because this is usually sort of the outcome. They if they are believed by the police that they report it to, if they are so lucky that it actually ends up going to getting in front of a judge, and then there is a trial that happens, often is a re-traumatizing experience for the victim, especially under conditions like cross-examination. This whole way up, the victim is often treated with more suspicion than the accuser, of course, burden of proof is on, in legal settings, burden of proof is on the accuser, but still, they are still subject to kind of more suspicion, if not disproportionate suspicion, or hostility, if not from the state itself, like investigating officers or responding police, or prosecutors or what have you, by the public. They are immediately vilified in the court of public opinion. And so after all of that re-traumatization and vilification, the outcome often is seldom conviction or any kind of accountability at all for the person who assaulted them. And so you go through all this re-traumatization and pain and suspicion for nothing. It ends up going nowhere, and you have nothing to show for it, because it's something like 1% or a fraction of a percent of sexual assault or sexual misconduct cases actually get in front of a judge, and this is why. And I think it's also worth noting as well that in terms of false accusations, of all the accusations of sexual assault or sexual misconduct made, again, the proportion of false accusations is, last time I looked, is less than 1%. So very disappointing outcome there in that Hockey Canada trial. Hopefully, I believe, or hopefully I think, I'm not sure if the victim is going to seek an appeal on the ruling. But yeah, that's where we're at right now. We're going to be here till oh, thanks, Pikachu, appreciate it. That's what I'm trying to do. So we're going to be here until a little afternoon, and then we'll as usual we'll drop into the majority report for the American story on what's going on. But what I want to talk about first up is I know on Thursday I sort of delayed talking about the UN climate ruling because I wanted more time to talk about it, because Thursday's stream is usually a little bit shorter, and we will get to that in a bit. But I also want to first hit on news regarding the situation in Palestine. As you know, the situation there continues to deteriorate, and apart from the usual, like just the genocide itself as conducted by the bombs and bullets of the occupation's war machine, folks are now also just like succumbing to hunger and sickness. I think, unless I'm fairly certain, at a faster rate than they're being killed by weaponry. And most notably is, and most horrifically is, the actions of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, which is a joint humanitarian agency or foundation, whatever you want to call it, that has been set up by the U.S. and Israel, and is headed up by the head of the late USAID agency, which of course we know no longer exists because of the cuts made by Doge, by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. And there has been steady reporting coming in of the GHF setting up what are supposedly aid sites where there is food and medicine, and when starving, unarmed, desperate civilians come to get that aid, they are gunned down by whether it's occupation forces or American contractors working on behalf of GHF. This is reporting that has been coming out, including first-hand accounts from people who had been working for the GHF, witnessing such things as like just firing automatic rifles into crowds, or firing full-on tank rounds at people. So it's an aid site that's just a disguise for a killing field, basically. Recently there has been news that France intends to, or has been signaling towards recognizing a Palestinian state, which on its face does seem like good news. I mean, it's certainly, we'll kind of get into kind of like what that actually means a little bit, but on its face it seems like good news, and on its face it's at least an important kind of change in rhetoric, where these I have Instagram. I also have Blue Sky. I'm not on Twitter or X. I'm on Blue Sky at Mothy94, but with an O, not a 0. So you can find me there on Blue Sky, or on Instagram, I believe. Let me just make sure. I can never remember what my actual Mothy 1994 with an O. So Mothy 1994 on Instagram. You can find me there as well. Yeah. So it's an important kind of change in rhetoric. I think might be sort of signaling that there is public pressure is having an effect. But I think, but it's not so cut and dry as France is suddenly like, oh yeah, cool, yeah, Palestine, yeah, hell yeah. The Because there are conditions on the recognition of that state, that basically that Gaza has to like de-arm, so they can no longer have any sort of like standing army or any sort of armed militias like they have now. The PLO would be, or that's not the PLO, but the Palestinian Authority would retain control of Gaza in addition to the West Bank, and so it would be more or less kind of like a reset to kind of pre-October 7th conditions where like they're not actually given a statehood. They're still just an imprisoned population within the occupied territory, within the Israeli occupied territory. It's just this is, I think, an attempt to kind of defang the Palestinian resistance, and the other thing as well is Canada was a signatory on a letter to I just had it and now I've lost where I had it. Was a signatory on a letter to one of 28 countries. Here it is. Was one of 28 signatories on a letter to sort of an open letter to sort of call for the end of the war, the genocide. But it's they're calling it a war. Of course, we know that that's kind of sanitary language. And so, they condemn the drip feeding of aid and the killing of civilians seeking the aid. So, like what we just talked about with the situation with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and just kind of sort of general kind of like condemnation of Israel's the occupation forces activities, and that they want Israel to kind of comply with international law. But still kind of the issue is, there's no, like, it's still very much like an ahistorical whitewashing, I guess, of the situation there, because still the focus is on, it still turns to, Hamas released the hostages, the people in Gaza need to be freed from Hamas. And which is just like a total ahistorical and deliberately so ahistorical kind of contextualization of the situation, because as we know, the reason why Hamas exists at all is because of the occupation. Hamas originally started out as part of a charitable organization, the name of which I'm blanking on, but it started out as an arm of a charitable organization that was active in the 80s, and then became sort of a more militant arm of resistance against the occupation. They sort of took up armed resistance against the Israeli occupation. They have been kind of strategically used by the Israeli government as, a deliberate kind of foil against the Palestinian Authority to kind of try and divide Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza by trying to paint the Palestinians in Gaza as just being sort of, barbaric and violent. So if the Palestinians in the West Bank kind of feel more sort of superior to those in Gaza, they are potentially more likely to be kind of more compliant with the Israeli occupation. But also, if there was no occupation, there would be no armed resistance in the first place. And so Hamas exists. Hamas is also not like the only armed resistance against the Israeli occupation. It is one of a bunch of different groups that are operating. But it is often painted as like the kind of one and only sort of army, I guess, in Gaza, and that is in part due to the fact that they were, elected in the elections in 2006 into government in Gaza, but that in itself is also a fairly kind of fraught history and narrative, because Hamas was so there were elections in the mid 90s, and there were elections again in 2006. The original elections were part of the Oslo Accords, where the Palestinian Authority was established in a joint agreement that the U.S. was involved with, and then of course Israel. And they established a Palestinian Authority as this body that, in name only, is of and for the Palestinians, but is meant to essentially just kind of be another kind of arm of the Zionist occupation, dressed up as government representation for Palestinians and their and the issues and struggles that they face. And so an election was held again in 2006. It had been delayed about a decade because of the head of the Palestinian Authority, would believe. It was Yasser Arafat. There were supposed to be elections in 2003, but Yasser Arafat, I think, rightly pointed out that as long as there is an Israeli occupation in the West Bank, it makes a free and fair election impossible. And then in 2006, so then after then Arafat died in 2004, but then in 2006 there was elections, but there was already distrust of the Palestinian Authority, because I think people rightly recognize that it's not really advocating in the interests of Palestinians. It's meant to it's meant to kind of make Palestinians more compliant with the occupation, and is working on behalf of the interests of Israel, not of Palestinians. And so on the other side you had Hamas, who was running for election, and they were running under a different name, something like Change in Peace. I can't remember what it was, but basically They were running for election in Gaza, or like running for election in Gaza, and the Israel had sort of said that there is no that you can't there can't be any campaigning for Hamas in any of the West Bank territory, trying to, I guess, stifle this opponent. But they ultimately won the election because they offer a meaningful path of resistance, towards a meaningful path towards liberation, whereas the Palestinian Authority just kind of offers, or is trying to just make platitudes and assimilate with the illegal Zionist occupation. So all that to say that this narrative about this is all about Hamas releasing the hostages, this is all about Gaza must be freed from Hamas, is all very ahistorical. I mean, it's Zionist propaganda meant to further alienate people from any sort of solidarity with Palestinians. It's meant to. It's part of the painting of Palestinians in Gaza as being, barbaric and violent and animalistic, just the dehumanization of Palestinians in Gaza, because people in Gaza aren't being killed by Hamas. They're being killed by Israeli bombs sent to them by the U.S. And as we talked about, I think two or three streams ago, Canada is involved in that process too, as part of the, there are Canadian contractors that are a part of those American Department of Defense weapons purchases to then be sent to Israel. And so, Canada has pledged to send $30 million to in humanitarian funding to the Gaza Strip. What that means in practice is unclear. This is from a CBC article yesterday, and then I believe there's an additional $10 million going to. I don't think it's $10 million out of the $30 million. I believe it's $30 million to Gaza Aid, and then $10 million to the Palestinian Authority to work towards statehood. However, Canada has not and does not seem to intend to follow France's lead in, even conditionally recognizing a Palestinian state. As empty as the recognition from France is, it's more sort of like a bargaining chip than any sort of actual recognition. But Canada does not seem to intend to follow that lead. It seems the UK right now might do so, but I wouldn't hold my breath, because Trump, I think, is really putting the screws to Keir Starmer, and so I wouldn't hold my breath on the UK even conditionally signaling to recognize a Palestinian state. Carney has sort of, and like I said, this is, Canada's sort of saying all the nice things and stuff, but there's no kind of, it's talking the talk, not walking the walk, and even the talk isn't great. Yeah, so that's the situation kind of as it stands right now. And the other thing I wanted to mention too, is just that Canada had paused paused approvals on new exports to Israel as of January last year, 2024. However, there's still been about 20 million. As of 2024, Canada had exported about $20 million worth of military goods to Israel. And then, of course, as we mentioned, again, a couple streams ago, Canada was part of a $1 billion U.S. Department of Defense U.S. Department of Defense order for weapons to be sent to Israel. And Canada, I believe it sent about 80 million worth of artillery rounds to Israel from our General Dynamics plant in Quebec. So despite the rhetoric, Canada does not seem to be really kind of pumping the brakes at all on support for the genocide. And actually, just sort of looking here at the, I want to share this because it's actually quite interesting and I think worth sort of seeing here. This is from the I'm blanking on the acronym, the CGPME. Which is reporting on Canada's complicity in the genocide in Palestine, the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Sorry, I blanked on the acronym. But I think this is just worth kind of sort of looking at here, is just sort of how Canada's spending in terms of military exports to Israel has been tracking over the last decade. And as you can see, sort of from 2015 to 2024, our export values have a little more than doubled. You can see here it's probably about 7.5 million in 2015, and now here we are at nearly 20 million in 2024. So yeah, a little over doubled in the last decade. And of course, you see it peaked here in 2021, 2023, of course, when there were flare-ups in the violence. But yeah, so also just we have roughly doubled our military exports to Israel in terms of dollar value in the last 10 years. So yeah, quite shameful on the part of the Canadian government. Let's switch gears a bit here and talk about the ruling that came down from the UN World Court last week, which is pretty significant. It re-underscores the existential threat that the climate crisis we're in is. And also importantly, I want to show you this as well. The ruling also says failure of a state to take appropriate action to protect the climate system may constitute an internationally wrongful act. So it's looking like that countries that continue to pollute, continue to destroy or otherwise damage our environment because of negligence or just don't care, could be in violation of international law. As we've seen with how much is international law has counted for with regards to the genocide in Palestine. It's a lot of talk. There's not any real teeth behind that, but it's still an important strengthening of rhetoric. It at least signals a trend that the direness of the situation is at least being more formally recognized, acknowledged. I will never say that like rhetoric counts for nothing, because this is how we see the outcome of public pressure from like the protests that we go to, the petitions that we sign, the causes that we donate to. The goal is to start seeing things like this statement here from the UN, or when it comes to stuff like France signaling that they will recognize a Palestinian state, even though these may be kind of, on the whole, often tend to be hollow, or often tend to be just for show or for aesthetic or for PR or whatever. It's a change in how the situation is being thought of at the higher levels, which means that the trend could continue to action, and that the point being that public pressure does have an effect and an impact, that we have an effect and an impact when we work together. It's not enough, obviously, to just sort of put that in writing, but it's a step in the right direction. And we'll see kind of where this ultimately goes. But it sort of it also just sort of acknowledges about with regards to, of course, climate change being caused by human-made emissions, just that those are not territorially limited as well. So there of course emissions or pollutants can get carried across on the jet stream. So emissions from a plant in Ohio could find their way to could start causing acid rain in Germany, that kind of thing. But I think as well it's also important to think about it in terms of the supply chain, because the other thing that I want to share with you is the emissions gap report here. So this is a table of per capita emissions by selected countries and regions. So we have here China, US, India, the EU, Russia, Brazil, the African Union, and then the least developed 45 countries. And so you have here, so this is for total greenhouse gas emissions in 2023. So you have China, 16,000 megatons of CO2. So a megaton, I believe, is if giga is a billion, and I think mega is a million. So let me just hang on. I want to check and make sure that my that my math on this is correct about a gigaton. Hold on, because I don't want to just rely on my best. Okay, I was right. Kilotons, 1,000 tons, megatons, a million tons. So let me go back to the emissions gap report here. So 16,000 megatons of CO2 generated by China in 2023. And then you'll see here the U.S. About little under 6,000 megatons of CO2 emissions in 2023. And so you're looking at that and thinking, oh, wow, China is far and away the biggest polluter. Why am I, as an American or a Canadian, that's not even on this table here, why is there so much focus on the emissions of me or of my country when you have like China and India so high up the list? And that's because the emissions in terms of not being territorially limited, or pollutions not being territorially limited, isn't just about the actual travel of particulate matter through the atmosphere or along the jet stream or wind currents or ocean currents. It's also about the supply chain. In our neoliberal society that we live in, or neoliberal capitalist society that we live in, where you have in the imperial core, starting in roughly the 80s, countries like the US and Canada exporting manufacturing labor to be done cheaper in countries like China or India. And so you have factories there producing for any number of clothing brands, for your phone, this computer that I'm talking to you on, this microphone I'm using to talk to you, is being made there. And so those emissions do not give the full picture of the fact that a lot of those emissions are because of production for North American markets, stuff that's being made to then be sent to you and me. And that is why it matters. That is why it's a global effort, because of the supply chain, because we are still complicit in that. We are still complicit in the 16,000 megatons that China emitted of CO2 that China emitted in 2023. Just because it's not done here, on our soil, doesn't mean that we're not responsible for it. And so, and then of course too, interesting that of the sort of the single countries here, of these countries sort of listed here, the U.S. has the highest historical emissions from 1850 to 2022, 527 gigatons of CO2 emissions. That's giga is a billion tons. So 527 billion tons of CO2 in the last 170-ish years. And so, which I think is just interesting. If you were to probably plot that on a graph, I imagine you'll sort of see, although this is kind of like starts at kind of the end of the Industrial Revolution, which is when we do see historical trends of emissions like really spiking up, of course, the introduction of factories and whatnot. But I think it's just interesting how you'd probably see that kind of track and then probably drop off around the mid to late 20th century, or start to trend down at least around the mid to late 20th century. And I'm sure you would see a corresponding jump in emissions in places like China and India as manufacturing is outsourced. So, yeah. So that is interesting, and I think is worth just bearing in mind when looking at these numbers, especially when looking at stuff like seeing like, oh, the U.S. Has decreased emissions by about 1% from 2022 to 2023, and some of that may be some given sort of climate initiatives or what have you. But I think as well, it's also worth thinking about the other factors of like, well, where is production actually happening? Like, how would the economy change in that year? Was more manufacturing moved overseas? I mean, they were out of COVID at that point, so, but like, there's also like things about kind of like travel as well may have not quite has bounced back by 2023. But I think the main thing is it doesn't give the picture of kind of the organization of the global economy. Okay, so oh yeah, this is something I noted down too. Just that the U.S. accounts for a fifth of global emissions produced since 1850, and they're also one of the highest. As you're seeing here, they're also one of the highest per capita GHG emitters. So that's like 18 tons of CO2 per capita, which I believe is for every like 100,000 people. Yeah, I believe it's like it'll probably be something like per 100,000 people. It's one of the highest per capita emitters behind, topped only by Russia, which has 1 ton more. Yeah, so yeah, and the other thing too I wanted to show is this graph here, which here, let me just transition over here. Actually, hold on one sec. There was a there's an acronym here. It's for NDC countries, and I've forgotten. I wrote a bunch of this up sort of last week, and I should have written down what nationally determined contribution. Okay. So this graph here, this is the landscape of current nationally determined contribution targets for G20 members collectively and individually by 2030. So basically the NDC, or nationally determined contribution, is just kind of like the emission goal that the country needs to hit by 2030. So you have here kind of folks over here less likely to achieve their contribution, their nationally determined contribution. Folks over here are more likely to do so. Canada's kind of over here and the less likely to. Our emissions have been going down though. We have seen looks like about 20-ish% drop compared to 2019 levels, which is what this vertical axis is here. So we have been trending down. So this is change in emissions under current policies in 2030. So we will be so under our current policies, we've reduced our emissions by about 20%. Change in emissions under unconditional NDC. So under the if we were to be on track to kind of meet the 2030 goal, we would have to be reducing our emissions by about like 40%. However, our emissions have like plateaued, which is what this this yellow circle here is indicating. It basically just means that our emissions have already peaked, and that they are either plateaued or coming back down. And then purple here means that these folks are still trending upwards on the upside of the peak. So yeah, so Russia over here, post peak, but their emissions have actually gone up 20% since 2019. And if they were to sort of meet their targets by 2030, they would need to be reducing their emissions they would need to be hold on. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. Yeah, so hold on. Let me just make sure that I'm reading this right. So regardless, Canada has the emissions under our current policies have dropped about 20%. This here, change in emissions under unconditional nationally determined contribution in 2030. I think this just is actually like a projection of kind of like what to expect by 2030. So it's expected that Russia's going to actually, that they are expected to increase emissions by about 40% by 2030. I believe is what that's actually saying. So under current policies, global 2030 emissions are projected to be 57 gigatons, which is slightly higher than last year's assessment, around 2 gigatons above the unconditional NDCs. So collectively, the G20 members are also still assessed to miss their targets for 2030, with current policy projections exceeding NDC projections by a gigaton in 2030. Right. Oh, I see. So they'll still be 40% over the target by 2030 for Russia, and Canada will be, it looks like 40% under the target. But we're still less likely to achieve that target emission goal. So we have. I also just want to take a look at sort of like some of the kind of spending that Canada has been doing so far to meet sort of climate objectives, or just what they've been doing so far. We have invested a little over $4 billion in different grants and initiatives, mostly stuff around kind of retrofitting or upgrading or otherwise like greenifying buildings or existing infrastructure, or grants for new builds and new infrastructure. So some of that includes hold on. Where was the breakdown of the actual 2.6 billion? Okay. Or sorry, not 2.6 billion, but the actual. Okay, so here we have $2.6 billion for the Green Homes Grant, make their homes for making folks' homes more energy efficient. $1.5 billion to the Green and Inclusive Community Buildings Program, which provides funding to support projects that improve energy efficiency. And then this works out to about roughly 300 million to 332 million to different Indigenous housing initiatives. So 48 million to infrastructure, 64 million to the Northern Reach program, and then 220 million to the Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities program. So we are doing some stuff. We are trying to, it seems, kind of greenify or make at least our buildings and infrastructure more efficient. However, it's not quite enough. Um, Partly, the emissions gap report from the UN, just also states that I'll just show you. While climate policy has advanced in many countries, there's still a lack of studies that evaluate their effects on GHG emissions. Um, and so a bit of it is it's unclear as to how well this is going to work because there's just a lack of research or studies or kind of investigation into how emissions may change. Um, and so it makes it hard to kind of it's hard to know if this is going to be enough. It doesn't seem like it's going to be enough. Um, and so so it's I mean sort of the kind of the meat and potatoes of it is it's not enough and that we're not going to meet our emission targets. Um, and Canada has sort of, this is from the government of Canada's website, that they have sort of signaled that they intend to mobilize private sector financing to support more retrofits, more. It's all more of the same, more mobilization of the indigenous sector financing, explore increased stringency of federal funding programs to avoid locking carbon into the building sector. So it's still a lot of, this is a problem, is it's still a lot of like reliance on the private sector to kind of take on this responsibility, which is sort of the reason why we're in this situation in the first place, because of the private sector, because of capitalists' interests, because of profit motives, because of you know because it's been cheaper to export labor to out of the imperial core to other countries where labor is cheaper. And then on top of just the emissions of production, there's also the emissions of transportation of goods back and forth between those countries. And also when it comes to the to product waste as well, when stuff like your computer dies, your phone breaks, or like your electronic waste, that all gets dumped and sent to places like in sort of Southeast Asia and Africa as well, India, where their shorelines are taken up with landfills of e-waste, or there's just e-waste that is collected on junkyard properties, and that e-waste is extremely harmful to the surrounding environment because of the leaking of stuff like lithium from batteries, or other sorts of chemicals or plastics into the environment, into the water, into the soil. And so there's also and this is also where like there is a social justice component to this as well, because it is this current kind of mode of production that means that people don't have safe drinking water, that people don't have access to their shorelines, that people don't have. It means it means you can't fish. It means you can't plant. It means you can't grow crops or feed cattle. Because of where this waste ends up, and it disproportionately ends up in places that are already either impoverished, otherwise struggling, often because they are former colonial territories of European colonial powers, if not, been victimized by American empire. And so it's I think it's great that Canada has spent so much money on infrastructure, but just kind of doing energy efficient retrofits on homes and public buildings isn't really going to be enough. And the problem is it's relying on, if you're familiar at all with kind of abundance folks or folks who, liberals who believe in the solution to the housing crisis being the private sector and unleashing and deregulating the private sector to build housing. It's the similar kind of rhetoric here where it's about, unleashing the private sector to do retrofits on their buildings, which I don't know how that's going to work out, because I don't think that's going to work out. I think that is a plainly silly strategy and is ultimately just kind of like signaling. It's a bit of kind of virtue signaling of making it look like something's being done, but in reality, it's just kind of more of the same that's happening, but it's just having a nice little fancy kind of dressing put on it. Not... and also, I think as well, the fact that, it's, we got like roughly $4.3 billion in spending accounted for by the government of Canada on these green initiatives, but it's only the 0.3 of that 4.3 billion that's going towards supporting Indigenous communities, and it's those Indigenous and rural communities that are most disproportionately affected by the consequences of climate change. They are most disproportionately affected by the increasingly severe forest fire seasons. They are most disproportionately affected by permafrost melting. A lot of Indigenous communities in the very remote north, or like in the Northwest Territories, most of the year they are fly-in or boat-in only communities, but in the winter they rely on so in the winter they may rely on ice roads for land connection, or they're relying on the permafrost that exists year-round to support land connection to whatever, airports, harbors, other roadways down to cities, that kind of thing. And those roads are melting or are becoming less stable. And so it means those communities are further isolated. And because of their isolation, they are further away from any kind of like help or rescue or aid in the event of serious disaster. And so I think it's very interesting and very kind of telling about where the government's priorities are, that a relatively small piece of that pie is going to Indigenous communities when most of that $4 billion is about investment in the subsidizing the our private sector here in Canada to take on these green initiatives that they don't care to do so anyway because it eats into their profit margins. Not that they're suffering, not that they're suffering at all, but yeah, I just think that is a bit rich, and I think just shows that our priorities are completely blinkered or out of whack with what's actually needed. So that's where we're going to cut it for today. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in and listening. we're gonna go now to the majority report. We're gonna connect in there. I wish you a good rest of your day. And we will be back on Thursday. Yeah, we'll see you then. Thanks so much for tuning in. Now we are going to flip over to the majority report for the story down south of the border. So thanks so much. We'll see you next time.